Welcome, everybody. This special bonus Left Reckoning episode, joined by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you, David.
And our good friend and comrade, Djene Bajalan, who has hopefully a new piece coming out soon. We'll be talking about in a bit. Djene, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you guys today. Always a pleasure.
No, I mean, I'm really excited to dive into this topic. I mean, it's a tough one. It's a dark one. We're going to be talking a bit about U.S. imperialism, about global hegemony. But I think to start that conversation up, it's the 20-year anniversary of the war in Iraq. Which, Lord, I mean, that's one of those things that's is hard to say, because it both feels like something that was very, very distant, and also something that is very real and present. And not to date myself too much, but it is one of those conversations that can, for me, it's I was 10 when the invasion started. So the beginning of my kind of consciousness of being in the world was defined by that. And obviously the aftermath, I think, is more so when I was, able to sort of understood what had just happened. But I mean, just to start us off, Djene, I mean, there's been a lot of discourse about the Iraq War, obviously, this week. I think most of it good. Obviously, New York Times, Atlantic have been doing all sorts of weird apologetics for the invasion. But, a lot of our audience are people around my age and even younger. I mean, if you were to tell, somebody who obviously has a sense of what that war is, what it represented, what it meant, how should people think about this conflict in 2023?
That's a really good question. I mean, for me personally, obviously the Iraq War was one of the defining features of my early adulthood. I was in my late teens, early 20s when the build-up to war happened. Mm-hmm. I was at university and I was studying at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is in London, and was a center of left-wing politics. It was a place where there was a very strong anti-war movement. There were a lot of students who had personal connections to Iraq there, including myself, of course. Obviously at the time, it was, I was a participant in the anti-war movement, not like a leading participant or anything, but I attended the protests. I was against the war. Because at the time, I mean, perhaps things were different in the United States, but in Britain, there was a general feeling that this was a kind of ridiculous war. There was not the same kind of patriotism that existed in America following the 9/11 attacks. So in Britain, there was a great deal of cynicism about this war. There was a large protest movement that emerged. There were, I believe it was 1 million people protested the war in Iraq. I had friends who came down from Hull to London to stay with me to attend that protest. So there was a big, strong sense of opposition to this war. Bush was extremely unpopular. He was presented as a Yahoo, an imperialist, all these kind of things. So, this was a defining sort of moment in my personal and political development and my understanding of the world, and also laid the seeds for, I guess, some cynicism, because despite all this protest and all this strong feeling against the war, nothing happened, right? There was no consequence from the protest movement. The establishment media belittled it. There was no real response from the government. Robin Cook, for example, the foreign secretary, resigned, but things went on as usual. And obviously, when the war began, there was very little. It was covered 24/7 on the news, but it didn't really affect people's daily lives to the same degree. I mean, in Britain, the armed forces is a lot smaller. The British were involved in the war, but the number of people who were personally connected to that war, it was far less. or at least in the circles that I knew, far less than perhaps might be true in the United States. So it was a time of sort of great disappointment towards political activism. On the flip side, for me personally, it was also kind of conflictual because, as some of you might know, my father is Iraqi Kurdish. My father had been involved in opposition to the Ba'athist regime. I'd been grown up with stories of the kind of oppression that had taken place against the Kurdish community, in particular in Iraq. The memories of the Anfal campaign of the late 80s, which was a genocidal campaign in which, hundreds of Kurdish villages were destroyed and between 100,000 and 200,000 people were killed in the course of that campaign. Kurds, Assyrians, and other communities were, brutalized. So within the Kurdish community, there was a kind of pro-war sentiment. People were cynical about the United States. They were like, well, the United States, they were backing Saddam one minute and now they're against Saddam, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So a lot of Kurds were pretty happy to see this war taking place, or at least they were looking forward to seeing Saddam getting laid low. And, at the time, my father was going on the TV in Britain, talking about supporting the war as well. So that was kind of a bit difficult for me as well, because, obviously there was a kind of fracture in opinion of, within my own family. And contrary to what people might believe, it wasn't because, like I said, Kurds were had a great faith in the United States, but it was, well, the United States were backing Saddam at one point. Now they're going to be backing us, and we better take advantage of that opportunity. And even amongst there were some small Iraqi Kurdish groups that were formally against the war. Most notably, the Worker Communist Party of Iraq. But in private, these people, their concern was less about getting rid of Saddam and more about, is this war going to affect Iraqi Kurdistan? What's going to happen? Those kind of more personal concerns, even though formally in public they were against the war. So, on one hand, I wouldn't, I don't usually call myself, a communist or anything like that, but, I was on the left nominally, and I just kind of thought that this war was wrong, not because Saddam didn't deserve to get laid low, but because I had a feeling, and I guess it was a kind of unformulated feeling at the time, that this, for some reason, would be a disaster, right? That the outcomes will be unpredictable. And in certain ways, obviously that's been proven correct. But even today, the history of Iraqi Kurdistan in the post-Saddam era is quite different from the history of the rest of Iraq during this period. So although there is a little bit more kind of discussion on the Iraq war, still generally people feel that, the removal of Saddam Hussein from the Kurdish perspective was a positive development. So I felt, personally speaking, I did feel very conflicted about the conflict between the rational opposition to what imperialism means, but also to the fact that, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, and I wouldn't be sad to see him go. So, and obviously that reflects my personal position on things and those contradictions that existed within my own perceptions of the war.
I'm curious, Djene, your perception of where people's heads were at broadly, because I found that interesting, that bit about people traveling down to London to and basically coming together to protest this stuff, and you touched on the limitations of protest angle of this, which I think is that combined with just the war itself, I think it shaped my politics certainly. I'm curious, did that anti-war sentiment, because on the other hand, I feel I don't want to be too optimistic about the psychic change that's happened in people, because I have some recollection of pre-Iraq War, how Vietnam was looked at, and it wasn't positively either. Like that seemed like a similar way we look at Iraq now. Is like some people saying this was a noble and tragic mistake, and other people saying it was a crime. Like I'm just curious, like your estimation of the consciousness of people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's hard to like quantify in retrospect, and people's perceptions of how things were back then perhaps change over time. Our memories of things are kind of faulty. But what struck me is that people who I knew who were largely apolitical came into politics, even if it was for a temporary period, within the context of the war in Iraq. It wasn't the same kind of opposition, for example, to the war in Afghanistan. I think, there was obviously the left opposition that existed to the war in Afghanistan, but I think most people were like, well, Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. That kind of makes sense. You play with fire, that's what you get. But the Iraq war was so egregious and so self-evidently, built on a very flimsy case that, people, I think a lot of people were like, oh, well, this is they're just lying us into the war. This discussion that takes place retrospectively about like, well, nobody could have known that this was all nonsense, I think is obviously what you might call a bit of ass covering, where people, try and justify their positions. And, the reality is, as much as we like to paint a simple narrative of this, the case for war that was made was not entirely fabricated in the way that people often think it is fabricated. So there was no evidence for the weapons of mass destruction, no like concrete evidence beyond the historical evidence that Saddam had used those weapons against the Kurds and against the Iranian armed forces during the 1980s. But also internally within Iraq, there was a perception that Saddam still maintained that capability, which most likely Saddam kind of fed those rumors for internal consumption. If you read some of the, there's a book by a chap called Faddis, who is was a CIA operative who was involved in the Northern Front operations in Kurdistan. And, maybe he's ass covering, but, his point was that, well, we heard human intelligence that, some of our contacts said that Saddam had these weapons of mass destruction, but we never said that there was like evidence of it. There was none of this like concrete evidence. So there was a kind of willful inflation of what could be claimed, because anyone with a brain cell would understand that, well, we don't have concrete evidence. There's these rumors existing, but Saddam Hussein is trying to maintain power over his country, so this might be a useful lie. It was extremely flimsy, and obviously a lot of the peripheral evidence put forward was extremely flawed or exaggerated, and things and things like that. So the people, I think people just didn't buy it. People just didn't buy the narrative that was being given to them. And then even if they did buy it, they were like, well, why now? Right? Why all of a sudden is there's this big march to war now, right? Saddam Hussein had been contained in the 1990s through the sanction regime. And from the perspective of the United States, certainly not from the Iraqi people's perspective, but from the perspective of the United States, the sanctions were very successful. Why? Because on one hand, they severely limited Saddam Hussein's ability to interfere, in overseas or in his neighboring countries. So fears of like Iraqi expansionism were basically curtailed. And secondly, the sanctions served to reinforce his regime internally, in that the entire economy had to be run through the state.
Mhm.
And this actually created the basis of what, some political scientists call a resistance economy, whereby the sanctions, while weakening an ability for the state to project its power externally, strengthens the regime internally as well. So you had a kind of situation where Iraq was contained, and Saddam's ability to disturb American allies in the region was limited. And, obviously there was the oil issue as well. But, people were like, yeah, like this is,
Mhm.
what's the rush? What is this sudden rush to war? Why are we even doing this? Iraq didn't have anything to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein didn't seem to be changing his behavior from the previous decade. So it just all stinked to high heaven. And I think, a lot of people just were like, this is nonsense. And there was not that kind of emotional, visceral response that existed in the United States relating to 9/11 to kind of mitigate that kind of cynicism.
So in a minute, I want to focus a bit more on the Iraqi Kurdish experience, both before, during, and after the war. But if you could, for our listeners, could you give folks a sense of what Iraq was at the time of the invasion, and what these decades of war and conflict meant for the people in general in Iraq?
Yeah, so Iraq's history in modern times has been one of great instability and violence, both from the state and, of course, directed against populations within Iraq, and, of course, directed against populations outside of Iraq, most notably in Iran. In 1958, there was a revolution in Iraq, or a coup d'etat, if you prefer, in which the pro-British monarchy was ousted from power, and a new republican regime was established under Abdul Karim Qasim. Abdul Karim Qasim was a British-educated military officer, but was left-leaning, anti-pan-Arab nationalist, sort of an Iraqi patriot. There's a lot of romanticization of his period in office. He was only in office for 4 years, but he tried to play off the Arab nationalists against the communists. The communists rallied behind him because he was a pro-Soviet guy. They ended up getting screwed over. And then in 1963, there were two coups d'etats. The first involved the Ba'ath Party, including Saddam Hussein, and then there was a second coup in which the more radical elements of that coup were ousted from office. And so you have this period, in the 1960s, where you have pro-Nasser Arab nationalist officers in power, and then in 1968 you have the Ba'ath Party, after being suppressed initially, coming to power. And from 1968 to the 1970s, you see the consolidation of that regime and the rise of Saddam Hussein, first as as a deputy leader, and then eventually taking over power in Iraq, where he purges his opponents, and he really establishes a kind of centralized one-man regime in the country. And concurrent with that is, of course, the rise in oil revenues, which leads to development in Iraq, and also, the increasing capacity of the Iraqi military. And then following the Iranian Revolution, when Saddam claims that he's threatened by the revolutionaries, there's a campaign of suppression against the Shia. And then obviously the Iran-Iraq war. That war lasts for 8 years. Saddam is backed both by the United States and the Soviet Union, who are basically concerned about the implications of the Iranian Revolution. In the late 1980s, the war ends in a kind of stalemate. Iraq tries to go through some economic liberalization, but the country is hugely in debt, especially to the Gulf countries who bankrolled this war. And this leads to conflict with Kuwait. the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Iraq clearly miscalculated that. The United States come in, and then sort of Iraq is put in this sanctions regime. But all through this, the Ba'ath Party regime, is deepening its hold on society. And just as a kind of point of comparison, people often like to compare the Ba'ath with the Nazis or something like that. But, the Ba'ath Party's rule, 3 decades, was longer in Iraq than the Nazis. So there was a very deep hold of that party in society. Many people joined just because it was practical, and they had to do it for their jobs. So you had this authoritarian regime, which, there are some books that over dramatize, the brutality of this, such as The Republic of Fear, which was very popular during the run-up to the war. But what you had is kind of like a tin pot dictatorship centered around, Saddam Hussein, his family, and the patronage networks that he established throughout the country. Especially in the 1990s, for example, there was a retribalization of the power as the regime attempted to kind of secure its position over the country in this changing context. So you have this kind of very unpleasant dictatorial regime that up until the 1990s had been, supported by the West. And then after the 90s became an opponent of the West. And this kind of was, the outcome of this 30 years of Ba'ath rule was that basically the entire of whatever seeds of civil society and independent political organization existed had been thoroughly destroyed, and you had a society in a process of degeneration. But one where the regime was still secure enough, there was no opposition that could really challenge it. So you had this kind of economic and social degeneration exacerbated by sanctions, but no real way of organizing or opposition to that regime. So it was kind of a zombie land, as it were, a situation made worse by the sanctions.
And then, obviously it's a lot to cover, but the past 2 decades, Iraqi political world and civil society have just been pretty thoroughly devastated.
Yeah, when the Americans came in, as people are probably very familiar with, they basically dismantled the Iraqi state, in particular the Iraqi army, which was, one of the main institutions of the Iraqi state. And in its place, you ended up with this sectarian kind of oligarchy emerging, as you had these various sectarian leaders amongst the Sunni and the Shia, as well as amongst the Kurds, becoming the intermediaries between the American administration and their broader communities. Now, the Americans didn't invent this, right? In fact, I don't think this was even the American plan on the get-go. They had this fantasy of just parachuting in and creating like a liberal democracy, which I would say to people who are cynical about that, I would say, no, it's even worse than you think. They actually did believe that nonsense. You had a bunch of 25-year-olds coming in, reading books about how they reconstructed Japan and Germany after the Second World War, and doing all kinds of ridiculous stuff out of hubris and arrogance and stupidity and their own delusions of how they could re-engineer a society. But, they got hit in the face by reality. And you ended up with, because there was no civil society, there were no, all the political parties. For example, the Iraqi Communist Party had been one of the largest communist parties in the Middle East during the 1950s and 1960s, completely eviscerated. It was basically just a talking shop for old men who had been forced to flee the country. You had all these exile groups coming in. They had no purchase in society. So who do you go to? The only leaders were those who, like religious, tribal, sectarian leaders, and they became the interface of society for the American occupation. And then, of course, American patronage began to flow down those networks, reinforcing that fragmentation of society. One good friend of mine, made a point, which was that, they replaced one Saddam with, 50,000 Saddams. So you ended up with these different networks vying for influence and power, where there had been previously only one supreme authority. You now had like these various competing factors who mobilized around ethnic, tribal, and sectarian identities, because those were the only networks that existed post Saddam Hussein.
And this is just like a kind of like political science or like a history point too, that I think folks, I don't know, maybe it's an American thing, maybe it's just like a general misunderstanding, but like, when you create a vacuum, when you create chaos, well, the groups that are going to be most primed to benefit from that potentially are going to be ones that already have purchase and organization, right? And sometimes that could be something where chaos happens in a society and like the Bolsheviks are able to come to power. Sometimes it's going to mean, more tribal systems or religious groups are able to benefit from it. I don't know. It's just something you see time and time again. You see it in Egypt, for example, right? That like to treat like Iraq like that's not something that's going to happen there in that chaos. I think your framing of it is right, that it's like it's even worse than being cynical. It's like they actually believed that something different was going to come of this.
I mean, that's what makes the foreign policy establishment so dangerous. It's not the cynicism, it's the idealism, and the I think it was members of the Bush administration who said, I think we remake facts on the ground, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
we make the reality, and Iraq was a pressure cooker, right? It was a pressure cooker under this dictatorship, and anybody who knew anything, even at the time, was saying it's a pressure cooker. And what the Americans did, like a bull in a china shop, they go in, kick off the lid of the pressure cooker, and believe that they can just put the genie back in the bottle, to mix my metaphors, and rebuild Iraq in the image that they wanted. I remember, for example, I was talking to one former American intelligence officer who said, yeah, I was one of the few people who knew Arabic, and I was like going down and saying, hey, Muqtada al-Sadr is kind of serious. These Shia leaders are like serious. And he was like, and again, maybe this was him ass covering, but, they were like, this guy's just a religious guy. He's not that important. Who are these people? Like they'd put their chips, as it were, in the hands of a bunch of well-connected political groups around Ahmed Chalabi, and who had these big connections with the neocons. But even within the American state, the CIA and elements of the State Department, like, these guys don't have any basis of power in this country. And so it was like the Americans were like learning the hard way that, their plans to remold Iraq in their image as this pro-American state where everybody would be grateful ended in disaster. And, I think this was an inevitability of what America would do. I don't think, people who view that things could have been done differently, I think that's a delusion, because that views the issue as being a kind of just a matter of policy and technocratic issues. But the reality is it's not just about policies. It's about the broader framework of how American power is expressed. You can make counterfactuals about them doing other policies, but, that doesn't have the policy route that was taken for a reason. This war was an ideological war, right? So of course its administration would be an ideological administration, and that ideological administration would have profoundly disastrous results for Iraqis, not out of malice, but out of something even worse: indifference, hubris, and stupidity.
Rove, it's not confirmed that it was Rove that said this, but the quote you're thinking of is to Ron Susskind of the New York Times Magazine in 2004. Bush aide said that the guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. Continued, that's not the way the world works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying the reality judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do.
I mean, like one thing too, I mean, like not to abstract too much, like the suffering of like the Iraqi people here, right? You know, the people who really, you know, are on the bottom of the boot with this, but like there is such the enthusiasm, the hubris of the people in power. I mean, like I don't think you can separate it from like this kind of end of history idea discourse, right? It's like we are the empire, we are able to create our own reality. This is the way that the world will be. I mean, like Iraq really, I think, is the culmination in a lot of ways of, you know, the 80s, 90s, very early 2000s, like euphoria of like, we've moved on from this like great conflict between communism and capitalism or whatever. And now like we are just going to, you know, put our desires and our fantasies on the rest of the world. I
mean, that's why I often will critique people who have a kind of crude materialist understanding of the war and say it was a war for oil.
Yeah.
Of course, war for oil, like if Iraq didn't have any oil, there might not be that much interest in liberating Iraq. And I use liberate in quotation marks. The point is, and I think you express it very correctly, that this was the ideological culmination of the end of history. This was the neoconservative project is in function indistinguishable from the logic of liberal internationalism and humanitarianism. Right? This neocon war was, quote unquote, a war for democracy. Now, of course, we know what the neocons' view of democracy is, but it was a war that was in a very important way defined by these ideological delusions of an American elite that was getting high on its own supply. A realist, a cynic, or a realist, someone, you know, like Richard Nixon, or someone like what's his name, Henry Kissinger, you know, this would not be the type of war that they would fight, right? This would not be their conflict. If they wanted the oil, they would bully Saddam into giving them the oil in return for, you know, gifts and favors. This was a supreme act of imperial hubris, which was a product of, as you say, this end of history moment. Kuba has a really good phrase he always reiterates, which is, it's always 1996 in DC. Like it's forever 1996. And the Iraq War was where that fantasy came like crashing into reality. And the cost of that is truly unfathomable. Now, you can make the case that, you know, if the Americans hadn't gone in, that sooner or later that pressure cooker in Iraqi society would have exploded, and it would have exploded in bloody sectarian war. But even if that is the case, there is no, you know, that doesn't make the Americans taking the pressure cooker off any more or less justified. You know, opposing imperialism, you know, societies will degenerate. America getting involved in that degeneration will very often, although perhaps not in every case, but very often will exacerbate that problem. It will pour money, weapons, and materials into that problem. So, you know, Iraq may have ended up in a humanitarian disaster in the end. I don't, you know, the capacity of the Iraqi state is greater than Syria because it had oil money. It had a more, but you know, that isn't a justification for what happened, which was America getting involved in this. And perhaps what I find the most disgusting part of this war is how Iraqis became collateral damage in what became a multi-trillion-dollar plunder of the U.S. Treasury. When Trump critiqued American empire, Trump is a crude imperialist. He's like, yeah, we invade a country. Why are we not taking the oil? That doesn't compute to him. He's missing what this war ended up becoming, what helped sustain it, and what helped sustain the war in Afghanistan was not some grand imperial design, but was 101 different contracting grifts in which people extracted billions of dollars from the American people, and that price was played in the blood of Iraqis and, of course, Afghans.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to circle back to the what if, like, if we didn't get involved, it may have erupted into sectarian violence. It's like, well, that happened. And if in that hypothetical, you wouldn't have like wasted your credibility and like maybe you could step in and play some sort of peacemaker role, hypothetically, and instead of like the warfighter role, which is of course what military contractors would prefer.
Yeah. Right.
And on top of that too, I mean, like the pilfering is so disgusting, and I don't know if it's worse to have it centralized or decentralized. But like one thing people forget about the Bush administration is they then extend the contracts, right? So that small groups could start bidding on weapons contracts for the U.S. and it just creates like this entirely sick world of small to medium sized like weapon delivering organizations with the United States. Yeah.
Another thing, Kuba, who was involved in the contracting world, one of the things that he told me from his perspective was like, nowadays they have all these kind of like minority carve outs for the military industrial complex. You have like Native American businesses can apply for this, African American owned businesses, you have an intersectional imperialism, get everybody in the empire's hands bloody. So, it is truly, it was truly perverse. And at the time of the war, I couldn't put my finger on exactly why I thought it would go wrong. Mm-hmm. But, in retrospect, I kind of feel like, this was always going to be wrong precisely because of the way that American empire functions. Yeah. To give an analogy, right? Imagine we're in the 1940s and we're talking, let's not use the Nazis because that one's a cheap one. Let's talk about Imperial Japan, right? Mm-hmm. All the things that Imperial Japan said about the racist colonial empires in Asia were true, right? The case for a co-prosperity sphere, kicking out whitey, the case for having Asia for the Asians was based on a reality of what colonial rule was. But Japan, as a militaristic imperialist state, could never realize those that discourse it used because of the nature of the state. Its occupation was always going to be brutal and extractive. To use the Nazis, the cheap example, it's people say if only Hitler, he had followed the First World War plan for using the minorities in Russia against Stalin, he could have won. It's but that totally misses the point about what that war was being fought about. That's, the racism was baked into that imperial project. It was not a matter of wrong policies being picked. And the same too about the exercise of American imperial power. Whatever, and I'm preempting what I guess Hitchens is going to say. It's we should have looked at this. It's you're missing the big picture of what the economic and political and ideological framework for that exercise of imperial power is. Because if that ideological framework didn't exist, that war might not exist.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, we can. I think it's time to pivot over to this because we've done some stuff on this program, and our friend Ben, has obviously done a good bit on Hitchens, right? And there was a period of time where Hitchens was saying some very, very valid and important things about imperialism about the U.S. role in the world. And this turn of his is very famous. Most people know it, but I think sometimes like it's worth revisiting on this anniversary because if you can maybe look at some of his other things and sort of hold this in your head at the same time, but engage with that other stuff. I get it. I mean, I do that as well. But I mean, this stuff is just truly, in my opinion, unforgivable. And I think you're the perfect person to do this with, Djene, because we have 2 clips here, and if you want to pause as we're going, let me know. If not, we can just play them through. And in it, the first thing he's going to make is the test that he has for people to be able to speak on the issue of Iraq. And it's an interesting one because the Hitchens move on Iraq in this conflict was very, very much centered around the Kurds, right? And as you were saying earlier in this interview, and I think most people who are listening to the show probably are familiar with, like, there is tremendous real grievance and pain, and the kind of remaking of history where it's like Saddam was not doing horrific things to the Kurdish people, right? It's something that you need to be able to reject outright. Like, you can make the case that the Iraq War was wrong without making the case that Saddam Hussein was like a nice guy who was just sort of misunderstood in the West.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to tack on one thing. 2008, I dated a girl who dad was in the military, was in Iraq, and big right wing Glenn Beck kind of guy, but was like polite and like would have conversations. And that the Kurd question was how he tried to sell it to me, and so I just want to tag that in.
No, I think that Hitchens gets the most play out of the Kurdish question because there's a real pain here. But unless you wanted to say anything before we jump in, Djene,
go ahead.
Let's play this in a little bit of this.
I have a couple of tests of my own for whether people know what they're talking about when they're talking about Iraq. Anyone who says that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy doesn't know what they're talking about. You hear that said quite a lot. They don't know. They don't know what fascism feels like. They don't know what it's like to see families forced at gunpoint to applaud the torture and execution in public of their family members. They don't know what it's like to see 180,000 members of the Kurdish people, at a minimum, killed by poison gas in the northern provinces of Iraq. They don't know what it's like to see at least that number of Shia Arabs killed in southern Iraq. They don't know what it took, Anglo-American, British-American policy, to put a no-fly zone from 1991 onwards over those 2 zones to make sure that those 2 genocides could not be replicated. They don't know what it would be like to be a citizen of Kuwait or Iran, seeing Saddam Hussein's army coming over the horizon, attacking your civilians in that way, abolishing, in one case, the whole existence of a member state of the Arab League and of the the Islamic Conference and of the United Nations, abolishing it, annexing it, making it part of Iraq. They didn't hear the speech from Saddam Hussein saying the only mistake he ever made was that he invaded Kuwait before he'd finished the nuclear weapon. He should have done it the other way around. First get the nuclear weapon at the Tuatha reactor, which we found as a result of the Kuwait war when we weren't looking for it. Get the bomb first, then invade Kuwait, then ask them what they're going to do now that I've invaded it.
Mm.
So that's the challenge there, and I'm curious to hear what you think about that Djene. I will just say that he employs real pain in a way that is like rhetorically moving, right, in the sense of if you think that these aren't big issues, then you don't know what you're talking about. But again, as we've been saying throughout this interview, the point here is while these things can be true, what ends up happening after ends up continuing and making, for a lot of people, this pain permanent and worse. But I'm curious how you would respond to that challenge if you're on the other side of the stage, Djene, when he makes that kind of pitch to folks.
Well, the reality is, a lot of the stuff people said about Saddam Hussein was true. It was a very bloody and brutal regime. The question in my mind is not, is it a good or is it a bad regime? It's, what does the application of American imperial power do to that situation? And you can't run counterfactuals, right? But at the last 20 years, or at least the first 10 years after the Iraq War, the first 15 years, it has been an absolute disaster in Iraq. There's been enormous human suffering and cost, and America is implicated in that. And yes, I think it's very important to resist idealizing, Saddam as a resistor against imperialism, or downplaying the brutality of the regime. And in fact, I think, people who do that are just making the question easy for themselves, because they're just painting a nice fairy tale for themselves that America bad and everybody who opposes America is good. But this is a brutal, barbaric world. And I don't blame a lot of Iraqis. And there were, especially when the Americans first came in, there wasn't the kind of hostility, for example, in the Shia South that came to be after what people understood the American invasion would mean. That it took, maybe like 6 months before you began to see real discontent in the Shia provinces. There was a kind of wait and see. Saddam sucked. Maybe this is going to be a fresh start for them. I don't blame people wanting to see the back of Saddam Hussein, right? But, we live in America. Well, I live in America now. I lived in Britain at the time. And, it's our responsibility to impose our military industrial complex and our imperial machine, not because those who are fighting against it are, quote unquote, the good guys, but because that imperial machine is in and of itself detrimental to both people in the developing world and also to people in the imperial cause.
And we're going to play some more of Hitchens talking about what has been achieved, but in terms of historical fairness, I mean, for the Kurdish people, right, who's like the group that I know Hitchens really cites a lot. I mean, could you talk about the modern implications, because there have been some openings, but I think that but I just really quick, I just want to say that again, the Hitchens case here is that the United States military is coming in. They're going to depose Saddam Hussein, and then we're going to see free, independent Kurdistan, right, develop out of this, right? He paints this liberation story that is not what ends up happening in reality. But
yeah, can I just tag on there? The nuclear proliferation argument he ends with, I think a lot of people have taken the other example, is that, go get nukes quick before America invades your country.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the lesson, I would take away from it if I was a country opposed to the United States. Get the nuke at all costs, because if they come for you and you don't have one, you're going to be screwed. Makes total logical sense. But I mean, from the Kurdish perspective, I think it's a little bit disingenuous to talk about it in terms of the 2003 war. And I'll tell you why. Much of Iraqi Kurdistan had in fact ejected Saddam Hussein in 1991. So as people might remember, following the first Gulf War, there were popular uprisings in Iraq. And one took place in the south. It was brutally repressed. And one took place in the north. And that was in the process of repression. But the international community responded. Now, the reason it responded, I would argue, is primarily because of Turkey. Why? Well, the early 90s, Turkey was beginning to face this huge insurgency from the Kurdistan Workers' Party. There was a massive upsurge in Kurdish militancy. There was a guerrilla warfare being fought. Turkey, under Turgut Özal, who was a kind of atypical Turkish president who was a bit more open to Kurdish issues, they realized if they suddenly had 3 million Iraqi Kurdish refugees living in camps on the borders of Turkey, that was going to massively destabilize Kurdish area. So, Turkey, the United States, Great Britain, basically provided air cover and military support for the creation of an autonomous Kurdish region. This autonomous Kurdish region had actually officially been established in the 1970s. One of the first things Saddam did, the Ba'ath Party did when it came to power, was neutralize the Kurdish insurgency by conceding an autonomy agreement, which later on became autonomy in name. This autonomy, though, this uprising provided the opportunity for basically Iraqi Kurdistan to become a kind of independent zone from Saddam Hussein. They even had their own currency. There was like the Iraqi dinar, and then there was the Swiss Iraqi dinar, which was the Iraqi dinar that the Iraqi Kurds were using. And so Iraqi Kurdistan had already gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, or at least most parts of Iraqi Kurdistan. And Iraqi Kurdistan was in a kind of like tough position after the removal of Saddam Hussein from the region. Iraqi Kurdistan was placed on a kind of double embargo, one from the Iraqi central government, which withdrew all its administration from the region, and the other, the UN sanctions, because as part of Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan was subject to UN sanctions. And you had, in that context, the two main Kurdish political parties, the Kurdistan Democratic Party under the Barzani family and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan under the Talabani family, basically taking over the remnants of the Iraqi state, of the autonomous region. So, for example, the parliament building that had been built by the Baathists for the autonomous region, that became the parliament, the ministry buildings, etc., etc. And what you had in Iraqi Kurdistan was basically a kind of liberalized version of the Baathist regime. It was still a patronage state, but it was a regime that had legitimacy amongst the population. Now, there was civil wars. Iraq intervened, Iran intervened, Turkey intervened in this region, the United States intervened, and it was kind of like a no man's zone for a while. Now, you could have made the case that, perhaps we don't want to invade Iraq, but if we do give a damn about the Kurds, let's facilitate an opening of the Iraqi Kurdistan region because it's not under the control of Saddam Hussein. So I think it's a little disingenuous in many ways to raise the Kurdish specter when, in fact, the UN policies that were and the United States policies that were, beggaring Iraq during the 90s were also beggaring Iraqi Kurdistan at the same time. So, they could have opened up the borders and allowed travel and trade to Iraqi Kurdistan without completely overthrowing the Baathist regime and destroying the rest of the country, but they didn't. And so the Kurdish issue, became a tool of emotional blackmail because it's undeniable that the Baathist regime brutalized the Kurdish population. But it wasn't just the Kurdish population that was brutalized. The Shia population was brutalized, and they were brutalized for longer, especially in the 1990s. So there's a kind of cynicism in this because, if you want to talk about policies, you could have developed a suite of policies that, the United States could have opened up to the Iraqi Kurdistan. They could have encouraged Turkey to work with them. This is not what I'm advocating, but if you gave a damn, if that was the main reason, was like you wanted to save the Kurds, well, there was a Kurdish statelet there that could have been opened up to the rest of the world, but it was subject to the same restrictions that the rest of Iraq was under at the time.
I can't help but feel like that's the sort of point that if Iraq was happening in the 80s and Hitchens was younger and going on Buckley to talk about, he would have maybe mentioned that. And it's sort of, I mean, it's really disappointing as somebody who was influenced by Hitchens growing up. Like, you see things he should get and he shouldn't be unaware of. And it's very disappointing.
Well, let's get to the second bit here because, so that's the emotional appeal. And like also just, for clarity's sake, this is 2008, right? So this is like enough time has like passed at this point that like even if, on the eve of the invasion, Hitchens maybe had this dream, right? You could see that that's not what is developing here. But here he is in 2008 being rather bullish on this, and also just throwing out here to Djene and Matt, if there's anything that you'll want me to pause and respond to directly, because it is a longer, it's like 2 minutes, feel free, and I'll do that.
The liberation of Iraq, in other words, the decision that we had to move the Iraqi people and the region into a post-Saddam era, will stand, I'm convinced, as one of the greatest decisions of American statecraft, as one of the things that American soldiers, male and female, and politicians who voted for it, those who've defended it, would be proudest of in the future of any decision we've ever made. Despite the ridicule, despite the incompetence, despite the failures, despite the disappointments, let us review what we've done. First, we have removed a keystone state of the Middle East from the control and sole ownership of a psychopathic crime family who owned all of Iraq and treated its people as if they were disposable citizens. I remind you that this keystone state occupies a choke point on the Gulf and an arterial carotid point in the world economy that cannot be left to the control of a fascistic mafia. I remind you further that it exists between the exorbitant Sunni Wahhabi theocracy of Saudi Arabia and the no less exorbitant Shia theocracy of Iran, that it is the keystone that allows us, yes us, we who have the right to do this, we who have the right to insist on oil, we who don't have to be ashamed of mentioning oil in the same breath as democracy.
I just have to pause it there because, I mean, this again, like you see like how he has to make like the humanitarian arguments about like the Kurdish people earlier. And then, this is straight up saber rattling, like nationalism. We have the right. We have the right to do this. We have the right to not be ashamed about talking about, all of these other things that come with the quote unquote like victory. This is like a real heel turn. And I don't want the focus of this segment to just solely be on Hitchens, but a truly, truly despicable shift from somebody who was rightfully arguing against American adventurism, before.
Yeah, I don't know what else can be said except that viewed from 2023, how disastrously wrong this has proved to be. Whatever their intentions might have been, right? The last decade and a half of Iraqi history has been, terrible.
Yeah.
You had a little bit of stabilization around the 2010s, followed by the rise of ISIS.
Yeah.
And you had, he's concerned about Iran. Well, Iran is now so deeply embedded in Iraq. It's, Iraq is, large parts of the Iraqi state are under very heavy Iranian influence. So even by his own matrix,
Right.
Even by his own metrics to make this judgment, none of these predictions have proven true because, as I said before, it fundamentally misunderstands what the application of American imperial power is and what it means.
Mm-hmm. Here's a second bit.
If we can recuperate Iraq, if we can recuperate its oil industry, if we can stop it being the private property of a psychopathic crime family, we can not only help the Iraqis, but we can undercut the monopoly or the duopoly of Shia Iran and Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. Does anyone think this is a matter of indifference? Or is anyone willing to get up and say, you, sir, very good for you. I admire your nerve. I wouldn't mind if you were the only one, as you seem to be. You're indifferent to it. The rest of us here, voters and consumers, all believers in freedom, might possibly want to take the view that it can't be for us a nothing question what happens to Iraq. We'll add, in the remaining time, that we have brought one of the great war criminals of the world to justice and put him and his crime family and his main complicit associates on trial in public in a country where, until recently, very recently, it was death, slow death, very slow death, to possess a cell phone or a satellite dish.
And I think, the ISIS point starts to make that celebration crumble. And, I know it's not fair, but we're just not going to watch the entirety of it. He then goes on to name Gaddafi in particular as somebody who has been defeated or at least slowed because of this. North Korea, and he makes the bullish point that it was not the United Nations, it was not the international community, it was Bush that was created this great non-proliferation achievement, which, as we were saying earlier, like what Iraq really ended up showing to any country that's on the other side of the equation when it comes to United States power. The question of maybe having a nuclear weapon starts to become even more critical than it might have felt in the early 2000s.
Certainly. I mean, everything he says in that point is just wrong.
Yeah.
And can be objectively judged as wrong from 2023. Like we've seen more than a decade of this, and it's just all wrong. Whatever moral indignation he feels, is kind of like irrelevant in light of history.
Yeah. Oh, and poor Hitchens, by the way, I don't want to make this the focus, but like poor Hitchens dealing with the insults and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, this was a guy who was giving pep speeches to Donald Rumsfeld. This is a guy who went on to have a very lavish media career, like during this period of time. Somebody who made tremendous amounts of money and tremendous amounts of influence, became very famous and influential in the American scene, right? Oh, poor Hitchens, right? He just keeps on talking about like how he's being personally attacked. Yeah, fuck that. But like, we talk, we've gone on a little bit, but I'm really happy to do it because I think this is a really important subject. And like, not saying that these things don't matter. I think a lot of the conversations about Iraq that we've gotten so far, understandably so, have been about the lies, the mistrust of the government, the attack on civil liberties in this country. What happened to people who were brought into service, stop loss in this country. I mean, that was a really brutal thing that, like, I think was probably my most conscious experience with that, were people who were just sort of in this forever deployment in the U.S. People who desperately wanted to get out of this war and were regularly just being brought back into it. But I think that, talking about the Iraqi context is really important. But anyway, we've attacked this Hitchian, view of the war, whatever he might maybe want to call his anti-imperialism, right? But Djene, you have a piece that's going to be coming out soon called "The Poverty of Anti-Imperialism," right? Talking about a bit of a different tendency, but one that also has like a lot of major issues as well. And, I was hoping that we could maybe sort of, talk about that a bit, because you see the strength of like a Hitchens point, or like the space for kind of Hitchens, like realpolitik. I understand these issues, getting more ground when you see some of the kind of like maybe the anti-imperialism of fools that we get like in a lot of contexts on the American left today.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I've said this to you before, but I think one of the problems with anti-imperialism in the United States, but also in the West in general, is that it is an inversion of American exceptionalism. Now, I'm not going to criticize anti-imperialists for being against American empire. I'm not going to criticize them, for example, for saying that the primary task of people in the left is to critique their own countries. I think that's all, makes a lot of sense. But I think what I mean by inverted American exceptionalism is the notion that the problem is American empire and imperialism as something that America does to other countries, which of course it does, but it misses the point that imperialism is also a global system. We live in the modern industrial era in a world state, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even, the Chinese and the Russians don't want the American empire necessarily to end, per se. Do the Chinese want to pay for the Navy to keep the sea lanes open? Think back to Adolf Hitler. When, Hitler was fighting the British, he wanted to maintain the British Empire. So we have this global system of imperialism, and America is the biggest imperialist power. It is the last remaining superpower, as it were, and of course has the biggest impact on the world. But that doesn't mean that those resisting imperialism are necessarily worthy of support. Now, they may or may not be, right?
Mm-hmm.
There may be more defensible regimes. There may be regimes that are indefensible. But American exceptionalism creates this politics of morality. So just as Hitchens is making appeals to people's morality, just as the neocons do, just the liberal interventionists do, the inverted American exceptionalist makes that kind of opposite moral claim that America's badness is not rooted in the fact that it's the largest capital power, but is rooted in some kind of specific American deficit. And that if only we get to a multipolar world, or American power is limited, our problems will be resolved. And what this ends up doing is people start arguing about the specifics of whether or not a particular intervention is justified. So, let's give an example. Country X is murdering its people. We need to intervene. The response is, well, actually, it's all lies. Country X is not murdering its people. This is all imperialist lies, and we should defend country X. From my perspective, you should be opposing American intervention, whether country X or not is murdering its people, not because you want country X to murder its people, but because by and large, there are two arguments which I put forward in the argument for opposing this. Number one is America is a bull in a china shop. So America, you may have a good case for a humanitarian intervention on those grounds, but America's going to mess it up. Now, that's a pretty strong argument given the historical record, but you could make the case there are examples where American empire, even, if it's the minority of the times, helps, like saved lives. I give the example of the 1991 uprising, right, in Iraq. They intervened to protect the Kurds. Kurds were spared a massacre. They didn't intervene to protect the Shias. They were all massacred. So you can make a pretty concrete shut and close case. That's like a like-for-like comparison, right? So, the bull in the china shop argument is a good argument, but it can only get you so far, because you can always make a special case, special pleading for a particular case. Say like, well, yes,
there will always be a special case, right?
So that's one problem with it. The other problem is we need to think about it from the perspective of what the military-industrial complex means in the imperial core as an institution that drains resources, directs society, shapes ideology. Even if you make the case that you could, there are uses of the military-industrial complex for good, right? The problem is every use of that power deepens the military-industrial complex's hold on society. I think most people would say America helping during the Second World War was probably a good thing. But the cost was the creation of this vast military-industrial complex that that Eisenhower warned against, right? This whole self-licking ice cream where it becomes perpetual, not because it's evil, but because it just creates these amoral incentives. So if you want to use, everybody likes pop culture, think of it like this. Imagine you have like a fantasy novel where you have, the paladin of good and justice protecting people around the world, but he gets this super sword that is evil, and every time he uses it, the devil or the demons are going to come back for the end of days. He wields it to protect people, but every time it's wielded, we get one step closer to that like disastrous outcome. So you have this kind of, you have the opposition to the military-industrial complex is most sound, I would argue, when we are opposing the military-industrial complex in and of itself, not about whether it can be used for good or evil. There may be cases that it can be. And the problem is with this kind of inverted American exceptionalism, they let themselves off easy because they create a moral binary. So you end up with a kind of conspiratorial worldview where every protest in a country that is not aligned with the United States is a color revolution, is a CIA operation, which is ironically a profoundly racist idea. Of course, America gets involved, other countries get involved in the internal affairs of countries. Why would they not? That's an obvious truth. But, you know, things are driven by internal factors, and it's not, you know, it's too easy to look at people who are perhaps hoping for a U.S. intervention and just say they're stooges of imperialism and they deserve what they get. It's a lot harder to say that they have legitimate grievances against their government, but as much as we, and ironically, it was Max Blumenthal who made this point, that, you know, back in, I think, 2011 or 2012, when he said, you know, like, I understand why these people want American intervention, but it just can't be because the result will be disastrous. So, you know, and one of the problems is you end up like, I can go on Twitter whenever anything happens around the world, I can like predict with certainty exactly how people will interpret it, because they only interpret it through this inverted American exceptionalism, and they don't take into account the factors on the ground, the internal dynamics, and the legitimate reasons why people might be opposed to regime. And I think when you base your anti-imperialism in a kind of dogmatic opposition to the military-industrial complex in the United States and in Western Europe, it doesn't give you like a clear conscience, because you feel bad. You're like, there are people suffering, and perhaps America could alleviate that suffering through a no-fly zone or some kind of thing. They could make it worse, right? But perhaps I'm wrong this time. Perhaps this is the one time, this is the exception, right? And you don't get that clear conscience. So you have like, you know, just as the resistance liberal thinks that the, you know, Azov Brigade is at the forefront of anti-fascism, you have like this alternative worldview where, you know, Wagner Group and like Chechen mercenaries are like fighting this great anti-imperialist war. I mean, I give the example in the article of the Uyghurs in China, right? It's a tough pill to swallow, but whether or not, like, let's just say 50% of the allegations are true, right? What's the outcome? Like, do we escalate with China? Because, you know, in whatever the case is, that's either going to end in nuclear war or like in an economic war that will pauperize people. And we're kind of helpless to do that, because if we appeal to the American empire to do something, right, we might get a cathartic release of like, oh, we can do something, but we are, you know, like feeding a bigger beast, or feeding the beast that is the one that we have to oppose. So I don't feel like, I feel very ambiguous. I don't feel righteous or good about anti-imperialism. It, you know, I was talking to a friend last night, who's born in the Soviet Union, who's you know, Jewish, Lithuanian, who on one hand sympathizes with the Ukrainians. It's like, she's like, yeah, you know, obviously there's fascists, but, you know, also there's a lot of just like regular Ukrainians who are, you know, defending their homeland and have a very simplistic nationalistic view of the world, where you defend your homeland. That's your duty on one hand. But on the other hand, it's like, this can only end badly, because we're going to be, you know, as America intervenes, you know, this conflict will become worse. And so, you know, you're kind of stuck in a position where you are, on one hand, you're getting hate from the, you know, the libs for being like a Putin apologist, but then you're getting hate from this kind of anti-imperialists who are like, oh, you're just like an apologist for American empire. And I think, that's like a dichotomy, that it's not to say that every time when you take the middle road, you were right, but it's just like, it just seems like there is no good answer to any of this. And our first step is to kind of recognize our powerlessness to do anything, and to know that if we appeal to the state to do something, we are just feeding those interests that are, making things worse. And that's that's really difficult to deal with, because you can't have a clean conscience. You're going to sit there and watch people get genocided. You like genocide? Would you have sat down and let the Nazis do a genocide? When is it when are we dealing with a Nazi level threat where it's like we do have to make that Faustian deal? And when is it that we're just like getting hyped up into?
And I mean, when you say like they're letting themselves off easy, I think that's the case. Like with the Ukraine-Russia thing, for example, like I'm fully up for conversations about like our meddling in sort of intelligence or NGO sort of stuff, or the rise of nationalism and that sort of thing. It doesn't justify the opening of a war. And like I feel like that is something that a lot of like the so-called anti-imperialists you're talking about, they'll say like, yeah, because when you say like, oh, okay, Russia was just putting down this stuff that was getting out of hand on the other side of its border, to me that sounds an awful lot like what we're going to hear about Mexico. Like they're killing all of these Americans with these drugs and they're just letting it go. And so now all of a sudden it's like, well, America can just go invade Mexico now. Like you say, actually dealing with it and objecting to it on the proper grounds, as opposed to trying to like act like the reality is more clear cut, is a more firmer stance if you care about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to cheerleading. I think, people want to have like a neat narrative in which they can organize the world into good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
And, people will create all kinds of theoretical positions, but, people are, you have leftists defending John Mearsheimer, who takes a realist approach to the issue. Well, what is the roots of Mearsheimer's realist approach? Well, it's because he's a realist. He believes the world should be divided into spheres of influence, and different great powers have to respect each other's spheres of influence. And we should be respecting Russia because we need to ally with Russia against the real threat, which is the Chinese. Mm-hmm. And my argument, I guess, as someone on the left is like, why do I give a damn about like how the Russian state feels, right? Like, why do I need to express? I'm sure that they do have good realist reasons to want to intervene in their neighbors, just as you can make the same argument for interventions into Haiti and into Cuba and to Latin America from a realist perspective. Mm-hmm. And people can put an ideological veneer on it, like this is part of the anti-imperialist bloc, blah 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 blah. But I just don't think that stands up to any scrutiny. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't say everybody is like a pure moralist on this. I think people do try and find ideological justifications behind this. But also, with the Chinese, I think, they're going to take advantage of this war for their own interest. But I don't think they're super happy about the Russians like destabilizing Ukraine and like putting the kibosh on the Belt and Road Initiative and rocking the boat. And, there's a lot of people trying to work out like 10-dimensional chess on this, like from some kind of like pseudo-Marxist realism, when it's like quite simple. You have, a clash at the very least between between the dominant imperial power in the world and quote unquote a counter hegemonic power, imperial power, or if they don't want to call it imperialist, like capitalist power. Well, my friends, you can make the same argument about Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, who were fighting against the hegemony of Anglo-Saxon imperialism during the 1940s. Soviet Union complicates that question, but I think the analogy is true. It's like just because America is provoking, and America did provoke Japan into the war, by being very hypocritical on not recognizing Japan's sphere of influence and then forcing them to keep the Chinese markets open when they were like, hey, China's right next to us. This is our natural market. So you end up in a kind of silly great power politics where you have a lot of people on the left just defending indefensible regimes where really, like, we don't have a stake. I mean, we don't have a stake in these great power conflicts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, there's parts of it, I think, and it's like left iteration. I think it comes out of like powerlessness, and you see the same thing in politics too. You see the same thing in history, right? Like the heated debates where it's like, I would be this guy, you know what I mean? Like I would be this guy in this moment of history, because you can abstract like the frustrations and feelings that you have in like your personal life, like into these great historical conflicts, because you don't feel that that's something like in front of you right now that you're able to influence. But on the question of like, Russia, Ukraine, it's like, it's one of those things that it's like, it's extremely difficult, to watch, like just knowing that this conflict is ongoing, knowing the suffering that comes out of it, and being able to try to take a position that, well, I don't agree with Putin being able to roll tanks and, run over a country like that. But do I think that like American intervention or, participation in this thing is going to slow or lower the casualties or make this, better? I can't tell you that I do. And like, we're not the victims either, right? But like the reality is like people who like are getting in arguments about this, like you feel it, it's devastating, and like you do want. I understand the appeal, for example, of like the easy answer, right? Because then you get to root for something, you get to tell yourself a story instead of like looking at this plain hard reality. Like this is an absolutely horrible thing that is ongoing, and our ability to like, do something about it is extremely, extremely limited, apart from maybe saying, United States, don't get involved militarily, questioning and looking at like American arms shipments, and fueling the conflict on that level, right? Like that's not like the storybook participation that I think some people want to be able to have in politics. If that makes sense.
It's what the kids call cope, right? You cope with your powerlessness by externalizing your hopes to like, there's going to be this like blow to American imperialism. There's going to be this Eurasian like anti-imperialist blocs, and this is going to pave the way for socialism. Mm-hmm. Now, I have no opinion on whether a multipolar world will be better or worse than a unipolar world. My general opinion is it'll be a step to the side. There'll be some groups that benefit, and there'll be some groups that get squashed. It'll just be a reordering of who benefits and who gets squashed. I don't think that is, necessarily an improvement on the situation. So I'm not like mourning the loss of, American imperial power. But honestly, I would say a lot of this quote unquote anti-imperialism, especially the types who adopt a veneer of Marxism.
Yeah.
It is just a reaction to the profound helplessness and hopelessness of the position of the left in the West. It is a coping mechanism that we are so degenerated and defeated here in the imperial core that, I'm going to just like find a football team and root for them.
And anyway, I know we've been here for a while, and we'll get you out of here. I will just say that, like, call me romantic or whatever, Djene. Like, I still do believe in some hopeful movements in history. I still call myself, a socialist most times, maybe a communist in my better days. I do believe in internationalism, and I can't tell you something that will squash potential of internationalism than, for example, when you see the protests in Iran and you say that the people there doing it don't understand their own interests and they're just stooges, for the Yankee forces, right? Like that you are foreclosing the possibility of solidarity and building an actual like independent international workers movement when that is the view that you take of the world.
Yeah, I think it opens you up to like profound scorn And I think it's just damaging to see.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I feel very hopeless about all of this. I guess I see the Left Project as a generational project. It's like, I'm not super hopeful that anything's going to happen in my lifetime, but I think people have to carry the torch, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you are black-pilled, you have to act like you aren't. But I definitely think a lot of this stuff is a product of defeat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's the fundamental question that we have to grapple with, because our opposition to imperialism should be rooted in the exercise of imperialism and not in rooting for the other side. That's not for us to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to run apologetics. And the danger, and this is kind of one of the points I wanted to get across in this article, the danger is that when the reality of, let's say, the position of the Iraqi Kurds, becomes apparent, when the facts don't gel with your pre-existing worldview, you either go in one direction, which is conspiracy cult, or you go in the Christopher Hitchens direction, which is that you become profoundly disorientated in what you're opposing and end up doing this heel turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see happen to Hitchens. Is in the aftermath of the Cold War, the global order was in flux, and things became disorientated. If we remain clear-eyed about what imperialism is, what those who are fighting, quote unquote, fighting imperialism are actually doing, who they are, what they represent. If we're clear-eyed about that, I think we're a lot less likely to become persuaded by these humanitarian arguments, because our arguments aren't rooted in defending the indefensible.
Yeah. I think that's well put. I mean, Djene, it's always such a pleasure to chat with you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, I appreciate you.
We'll have links below for folks to check out the piece once it's out. If you don't already, you should definitely be listening to Djene on This Is Revolution. Appreciate you so much, brother, and thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.